She was left all alone in the immense manor, abandoned by the fleeing heirs, and discovered in the darkness of a sick room the love that money could never buy. Can you imagine what drives a young woman of pure heart to risk her own life to care for a ruthless man, at the exact moment when all his relatives turned their backs and left him behind? But this story of tribulation, mystery, and redemption took place in the autumn of 1918, in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Before we continue this emotional journey, let me know in the comments from which city or state you are following this narrative, because I love knowing how far our stories of overcoming adversity are reaching to warm your hearts. The imposing Orchid Valley estate was known throughout the Virginia countryside not only for the vastness of its tobacco fields, which stretched as far as the eye could see like rolling green waves over the hills, but also for the rigid figure of its owner. Leonard Sterling was a tobacco tycoon of severe manners, a piercing gaze, and a voice that brokered no arguments. He walked through the curing barns with the posture of a monarch, always dressed in impeccable dark linen suits and carrying a solid silver pocket watch in his vest. The ticking of that watch was the sound that announced his arrival, causing the field workers to lower their heads in respect and his relatives to straighten their posture, driven by a mixture of fear and greed. In his early 40s, Leonard was a solitary man at the top of his empire, surrounded by a family of nephews and cousins who did not see him as a human being, but merely as a vault waiting to be opened. Through the cold corridors with their polished walnut floors walked Eliza, a young housemaid with silent steps and a gentle presence. She had no possessions, lands, or an important surname, but she carried with her a much more valuable inheritance: the old folk teachings about herbs, roots, and natural balms. With delicate hands and a soft voice that seemed to calm even the wind, Eliza kept order in the house without ever drawing attention to herself. Her natural scent was a welcoming mixture of fresh eucalyptus and sweet orange, an aroma that emanated from the salves she prepared herself in her spare time. Unlike the blood-sucking relatives who fawned over Leonard, the young woman maintained a respectful distance, but her observant eyes had noticed something that no one else seemed to see. She knew that behind that facade of ice and authority there was a man who had built a magnificent glass greenhouse at the back of the property, solely to cultivate the rarest and most fragile orchids in the region. The estate's routine followed its rhythm of wealth and appearances until autumn brought with it the dreaded Spanish influenza, a severe illness that had begun to sweep through the neighboring towns, bringing delirium, intense pain, and a profound fear. No one expected the disease to cross the gates of Orchid Valley, much less that it would choose the untouchable Leonard Sterling as its target. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky suddenly darkened and a cold wind swept through the manor's verandas. Leonard was in his study, reviewing the ledger books, when a dry, heavy cough took over his chest. At first he tried to ignore it, refusing to show weakness, but the next morning the tycoon did not come down for breakfast. The fever had struck him down with the force of a storm. His body sweated profusely, his breathing became an agonizing wheeze, and the strong man of yesterday was now delirious in his Egyptian cotton sheets, completely vulnerable. The news of the illness spread through the grand house like a wildfire, bringing not affectionate concern, but a selfish panic. Walter Sterling, the eldest nephew and the one most interested in the inheritance, was the first to show his true colors. The young man, with his snobbish manners and false smile, stopped at the door of his uncle's room, covering his nose and mouth with a perfumed handkerchief, his eyes wide with terror. Hearing Leonard's confused ravings and feeling the feverish heat emanating from the room, Walter hastily backed away. He muttered through the corridors, gathering the other cousins and aunts, saying with a voice trembling with cowardice that this flu took anyone in a matter of days, and that he would not stay there to be the next to fall into bed. The family's greed was swallowed by the fear of their own mortality. Feigned love did not survive the first test of suffering. That same night, as the rain began to lash against the estate's roof, a muffled commotion took over the back of the house. Eliza, who was in the kitchen preparing a horehound and honey tea, heard the sound of trunks being dragged and horses being hurriedly saddled. Peeking through the crack in the pantry window, the young woman saw the family's carriages departing in the darkness, under the torrential rain. Walter and the others were fleeing like rats, abandoning a ship they believed to be sinking. They didn't call for a doctor. They didn't leave instructions. They didn't even have the decency to say goodbye to the man who had given them a roof and luxury their entire lives. They turned their backs and left, leaving behind only the wet dust and the sepulchral silence of a 20-room manor. Loneliness hung heavy in the air, dense and suffocating. The silence of the empty house was deafening. Eliza climbed the grand wooden staircases with the tea tray in her hands, feeling the weight of each step. She knew the risk she was taking. The other servants, frightened by the attitude of their employers, had also gathered their meager belongings and vanished before dawn. She was absolutely alone with a gravely ill man. Upon entering the master bedroom, the sight broke her heart. Leonard, the feared tobacco baron, thrashed in the bed amidst sweat and delirium. His eyes were open but opaque, lost in a feverish darkness. The high temperature of the influenza had caused a terrifying complication, temporarily robbing the tycoon of his sight. He groped the air with trembling hands, calling for Walter, calling for his cousins, seeking some anchor in the darkness that surrounded him. But no one from his bloodline was there to hold his hand. Without hesitation, Eliza set the tray on the nightstand and approached. She sat on the edge of the bed, ignoring the fear of contagion, and firmly held Leonard's hot, trembling hands. He stopped thrashing instantly, startled by the unexpected touch. With a harsh and weak voice, the tycoon asked who was there, demanding to know why he couldn't see anything but blurry shadows. Eliza took a deep breath and, with her gentle and firm voice, answered that he was safe. She delicately explained that the high fever had clouded his eyes, but that it would pass if he remained calm. Leonard tried to sit up, his pride still fighting against his weakness, and asked in a sharp tone where Walter was, ordering that his nephew be called immediately. The silence that followed in the room was heavy. Eliza swallowed hard, squeezed his hand more gently, and revealed the harsh truth. She told him that everyone had left the night before, fleeing the contagion, and that now there were only the two of them in the manor. The revelation hit Leonard like a physical blow. The man who believed he controlled everything realized in the darkness of his temporary blindness that he was completely abandoned by those who claimed to love him. A groan of pain, more in his soul than in his body, escaped his cracked lips. He tried to pull his hand away from Eliza's, muttering that she should leave too, that it made no sense for a housemaid to risk her life for a blind, dying old man whom not even his own family could stand. But the young woman didn't move. She took a clean towel, dipped it in a basin of fresh water and orange leaves, and began to gently wipe his burning face. With a tranquility that defied the storm outside, she replied that she wasn't going anywhere. She said that the value of a life is not measured by the money it has, but by its need to be cared for, and that she would never leave someone behind in that situation. The hours that followed were a relentless battle against death. The fever spiked dangerously, making Leonard's large frame tremble violently. Eliza worked without rest. She ran to the kitchen, heated water, prepared herbal compresses, and returned to the room. The scent of eucalyptus and sweet orange began to permeate the sheets, the walls, and the very air of the room, transforming that somber bedroom into a sanctuary of healing. During the coldest hours of the dawn, when Leonard's delirium grew darker, and he felt as though he were plunging into a bottomless abyss, Eliza had a brilliant idea. She opened the dresser drawer, found the solid silver pocket watch he loved so much, wound the delicate mechanism, and placed the object under her master's pillow. The steady metallic ticking echoed in the silent room. That continuous rhythmic sound became Leonard's anchor. In his feverish blindness, unable to see the world around him, his other senses sharpened extraordinarily. The sound of the watch proved that time was still running, that he was still alive. But it was the gentle touch of Eliza's hands and the scent of sweet orange that began to work a silent change within his tight chest. In a moment of slight improvement, his breathing still ragged, he turned his face toward the direction of her voice. Leonard whispered, thanking her for winding the watch, confessing that the sound kept him from going mad in the dark. Eliza smiled, even though she knew he couldn't see it, and adjusted the blankets over his shoulders, replying that the most important things need winding up every day to keep working, including hope. It was the first time in decades that Leonard felt something disarm inside him. The rigidity of the tobacco baron gave way to an almost moving vulnerability. Unable to see the woman caring for him, he began to paint her portrait in his mind through their nocturnal companionship. He noticed how her voice lacked the trembling subservience of the other servants, possessing instead a compassionate firmness. He noticed the delicacy with which she applied the balm to his tight chest, a touch that carried more respect and affection than he had ever received from his blood heirs. The nights transformed into a bubble of intimacy forced by tragedy, where the sickness outside could not enter. In one particularly difficult early morning, the rain began to fall heavily outside again, beating furiously against the window panes. The fever had subsided a bit, but Leonard's weakness was extreme. He coughed, gasping for air, and instinctively reached out into the void, searching for her presence. Eliza was dozing in a nearby armchair, exhausted after 3 sleepless nights, but she awoke instantly. She quickly approached and held his hand, intertwining her slender fingers with the thick calluses of the tycoon. The contrast of their hands was living proof of their different worlds, but there, in that room lit only by a kerosene lamp, social differences had vanished. Leonard squeezed her hand weakly, and with a voice choked by an emotion he couldn't name, asked what would happen to his glass orchids, fearing that the autumn chill would destroy his only true passion. The mention of the greenhouse surprised Eliza. She didn't know he cared so much about the flowers while hovering on the brink of death. The young woman's heart warmed to see the humanity overflowing from that once deeply feared man. She leaned close to his ear, letting her citrus perfume completely envelop him, and promised sweetly that he didn't need to worry. Eliza revealed that during the hours when he slept under the effects of the teas, she would go down to the greenhouse, seal the drafts, and keep the orchids warm and watered. Leonard lay absolutely still. The man who commanded hundreds of people with an iron fist felt a hot, solitary, silent tear roll from his blind eyes and dampen the pillow. Someone, for the first time in his life, was not only caring for his sick body, but protecting the most fragile secrets of his soul. The days continued to pass in a routine of exhausting care and whispered confidences. Dr. Irvine, the old physician from the neighboring town, finally managed to reach the estate at the end of the first week, braving the muddy roads. Upon entering the room and examining Leonard, the doctor couldn't hide his astonishment. He looked at Eliza, noting the dark circles under the young woman's eyes and the jars of balm on the dresser. The doctor called the girl to the corner of the room and, lowering his voice so the master wouldn't hear, said that it was a genuine miracle. The doctor explained that 90% of men his age with that kind of fever would have already succumbed, especially with their lungs so congested. He stated with absolute certainty that it wasn't the pharmacy medicines that kept Leonard in the land of the living, but rather the tireless and continuous dedication of her hands. Leonard heard the conversation from the other side of the room. His hearing, sharpened by his lack of sight, caught every word from the old doctor. A wave of shock and gratitude washed over his chest. He realized the immensity of the debt he owed to that woman with the scent of sweet orange and the voice of an angel. When the doctor left, leaving behind only some basic instructions, silence reigned in the room once more. The fever had finally broken, his sweat was now cold, and the immediate danger of death had passed, although his weakness and blindness persisted. Eliza approached the bed with a bowl of hot broth, sat on the edge, and began to feed him the soup, spoonful by spoonful, with infinite patience. It was in this moment of extreme closeness that the tycoon felt an uncontrollable desire to see the face of the woman who had saved him. He raised his trembling hand, guided by her voice, and gently touched Eliza's face. His rough fingers traced her jawline, feeling the warmth of her skin, memorizing her contours. Eliza held her breath, her heart beating fast against her ribs, surprised by the unexpected intimacy of the gesture. Leonard caressed her cheek with his thumb and murmured, his voice now steady and laden with an unspoken promise, asking how much longer it would take for that darkness to pass, because the only thing he wanted to see in the world, from that day forward, was the face that belonged to that voice. The question hung in the air, charged with a light flirtation and a romantic tension that neither expected to experience there. Eliza felt her face burn, a shy smile taking shape on her lips. She lowered the spoon, covered the hand that was on her face with her own, and answered in a whisper that time has its own rhythm, and that the most beautiful things, just like the orchids in the glass greenhouse, only bloom when the right time comes. The ticking of the silver watch beneath the pillow seemed to accompany the synchronized beating of their hearts. The storm outside was beginning to ease, but what Leonard and Eliza didn't know was that far beyond the gates of the estate, the family that had abandoned them wouldn't stay away forever, and the true test of their feelings was yet to come. Before we follow the decisive steps of Leonard's recovery and the impending storm that is about to crash down on this newfound peace, I want to take a quick pause to ask you, who are following along, what was the moment in your life when a simple act of care completely changed the way you see the world? Leave your story in the comments, because these real experiences of affection and overcoming adversity are the true fuel of our channel, and I read every word you share with so much love. The weeks that followed transformed the imposing Orchid Valley estate into an isolated cocoon from the rest of the world, where time seemed to dictate its own rules, oblivious to the rush of men and the unbridled greed that crawled beyond those rolling green hills. The rainy autumn of 1918 slowly gave way to the biting winds of the harsh Appalachian winter. A thin layer of frost began to cover the vast tobacco fields every early morning, painting the landscape with a frigid white that reflected the pale, melancholic light of the full moon. Inside the manor, with its dark walnut floors, however, the climate was one of constant mild warmth, maintained by the uninterrupted fire in the cast-iron wood stove and the silent dedication that filled every room. The violent fever that had nearly taken the powerful tycoon to his grave had finally retreated, leaving behind an exhausted, thin body, completely devoid of the armored arrogance that once defined him. The feverish blindness, however, insisted on remaining like a stubborn grey veil over Leonard's eyes, plunging the tobacco baron into a world of shapeless shadows and absolute dependence. In this prolonged darkness, Leonard's days were measured not by the sun crossing the sky outside, but by the delicate sounds and calming aromas that announced Eliza's constant presence. The rhythmic ticking of his solid silver watch, still religiously kept beneath his down pillow, was the constant mechanical beat that kept him anchored to the reality of the living. However, it was the sound of the housemaid's light footsteps in the polished wooden hallway that made his heart race in an entirely new and unknown way. The mature man learned to recognize the rustic rustle of her raw cotton skirt as she approached the edge of the bed, the soft clinking of the silver spoon against the rim of the hand-painted porcelain bowl, and, above all things, the unmistakable scent of fresh eucalyptus and sweet orange that accompanied her like an invisible aura of healing. The man who previously only saw ledgers of numbers, thousands of bales of tobacco piled up, and plump bank accounts, now discovered the immeasurable wealth contained in the simple act of breathing the same air as the woman who saved his life with her own hands. The early hours of the morning were the moments of greatest trial for the tycoon's mind, as the silence of the empty estate threatened to bring back the bitter memories of the abandonment by his own blood. On one of those cold nights, hearing the wind whistle through the cracks in the sash windows, Leonard felt a crushing weight on his chest and called out Eliza's name with a hoarse voice. The young woman, who was dozing lightly in a green velvet armchair next to the bed, woke instantly, lit the small kerosene lamp, and quickly approached. She asked, with a tone heavy with concern and sweetness, if the pain in his chest had returned, or if the fever threatened to rise again. Leonard shook his head negatively on the pillow, stretched his calloused hand, groping the emptiness until he found the girl's slender fingers, and confessed in a shamed whisper that the only pain he felt was the realization that he had spent 40 years building an empire of lies, surrounded by people who saw him only as a bag of coins about to burst. Eliza didn't let go of his hand. On the contrary, she settled on the edge of the mattress, adjusted the thick wool blanket over the master's chest, and began to draw smooth, imaginary circles on the back of his hand with her thumb. With her gentle and welcoming voice, which seemed to have the gift of chasing away nightmares, she replied that life sometimes blinds us on purpose, so that we can learn to see with our hearts when our eyes no longer work. The housemaid told the tycoon a little of her own story, recalling the teachings of her late grandmother, who had taught her that a person's true nobility is not in the surname carved on the door, but in the ability to extend a hand when everyone else runs away. Leonard listened to every word with an almost devout attention, feeling that this simple woman possessed an ancestral wisdom, a purity of spirit that no college in the capital could ever teach Walter or his other greedy cousins. It was on a Tuesday morning, when the clear song of the morning robins outside seemed sharper than usual, that the silent miracle of recovery began to manifest physically. Leonard was leaning back against the white pillows, listening to Eliza sweep the floor near the large east-facing window. Suddenly, the thick grey fog that had covered his vision for weeks seemed to crack like a fractured window pane. The previously pitch-black shadows began to take on fuzzy contours and rounded shapes. He blinked repeatedly, feeling a sharp twinge of pain with the sudden brightness that invaded the sun-drenched room, and focused his trembling gaze in the rhythmic direction of the broom's sound. Gradually, the blurred silhouette gained vivid colors. He saw the dark brown of her hair, which fell in simple, natural waves over her shoulders, the golden morning light contouring her serene and concentrated face, and the extreme delicacy of her everyday movements. Leonard held the breath in his chest, genuinely fearing that any loud noise would make that divine image disappear like a cruel mirage of his tired mind. He said absolutely nothing at first. He preferred to observe, in dumbfounded and fascinated silence, the woman who until then had existed only in his imagination and in the tactile sensitivity of his curious fingers. Eliza moved about the room with the natural grace of someone who does not carry the artificial weight of vanity, adjusting the linen curtains and organizing the small glass medicine bottles on the hardwood dresser. When she casually turned to look toward the bed to check if the master needed water, their eyes met directly and undeniably. Eliza froze where she stood, the straw broom slipping slightly from her hands and falling to the floor with a hollow thud. She realized, in that exact instant, that the tycoon's brown eyes were no longer opaque, glazed, and lost in the emptiness of the ceiling. There was focus, there was depth, and there was a gleam of admiration so raw and intense that it made her blush violently to the roots of her hair. Leonard swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in his throat, and with his voice choked by crystalline emotion, broke the silence by saying that her voice was already the most beautiful and comforting melody he had ever heard in his entire life. But discovering that her face was even more beautiful than the sound was, without a shadow of a doubt, the greatest gift that divine providence could give him. His words, laden with a sincere, reverent, and unexpected flirtation, floated through the spacious room, making Eliza's heart beat wildly and fiercely against her ribs. She lowered her head, feeling her cheeks burn like embers, and replied in a shy whisper that the master must still be under the confusing influence of the strong teas she prepared, for she was just a simple country girl, with no silk dresses or parlor charms that deserved such poetic praise. The tycoon immediately contradicted her statement with a vehemence that surprised them both. He propped his strong elbows on the mattress, lifting his torso with a visible effort from his recovering muscles, and stated with unshakable firmness that true blindness was not the one caused by the influenza, but the ignorance he had carried his whole life for not noticing the rare preciousness that walked silently through the corridors of his own home. He extended his right hand toward her, keeping his palm facing up in a silent, vulnerable invitation laden with meaning, which hung in the air charged with romantic tension. Eliza hesitated for a fraction of a second, fighting her shyness, before closing the distance with slow steps, approaching the edge of the bed and resting her small, warm hand upon the calloused, protective palm of the tycoon. The soft touch, now accompanied by deep, barrier-free eye contact, sealed a mute and powerful understanding between the two. There was no longer the distant figure of the ruthless master and the invisible housemaid there, but only a man and a woman discovering love in the luminous cracks of adversity and overcome pain. Before we witness the decisive steps of Leonard's recovery and the impending storm about to break over this newfound peace, I will take a quick pause to ask you, who are watching us? What was the moment in your life when a simple act of care completely changed your way of seeing the world? Leave your story in the comments, because these real experiences of affection and overcoming adversity are the true fuel of our channel, and I read every word you share with so much care. In the luminous days that followed the miraculous return of his vision, Leonard's physical recovery accelerated impressively, surprising even the most optimistic expectations. The pulsating will to live, previously crushed cruelly by the cowardly betrayal of his family, had returned in full force, nourished daily by Eliza's constant, patient, and luminous presence. Soon he began to take his first slow, calculated steps around the room, leaning heavily on a carved dark wood cane and on the firm, welcoming shoulder of the young housemaid. With each hesitant step taken on the creaky wooden floor, the patient's former physical dependence began to give way to an unbreakable emotional complicity between partners. The tycoon made absolutely sure that all meals were taken together, flatly refusing to eat alone at the head of the long dining table if she wasn't properly seated in the upholstered chair beside him, as a true equal. They talked for endless hours about the small and wonderful things of daily life, about the changes in the weather, about the meticulous preparation of the lands for the next big harvest, laughing openly at the old stories and local legends she knew so well. The grand house of the Orchid Valley estate, which for so many years had been a cold monument erected to loneliness, demands, and reverential fear, now echoed with contained laughter, light footsteps, and pleasant conversations filled with subtle, indirect flirting. With every lingering look over a steaming cup of coffee, with every supposedly accidental touch when reaching for the same plate of warm buttermilk biscuits on the table, a spark of contained desire and genuine love grew stronger, warming the bruised hearts of both. Leonard felt like a renewed man, as if the fever had burned away not only the illness, but all the bitterness accumulated in his soul. On a sunny and particularly cold afternoon in late winter, Leonard made a decision that would require all of his precious, newly recovered energy. He adjusted the thick grey wool shawl over his broad shoulders, planted the rubber tip of his cane on the polished wooden floor, and looked intently at Eliza, who was carefully folding clean bath towels, smelling of lye soap near the main door. With a determined and mysterious gleam in his brown eyes, he asked her to put her tasks aside and accompany him outside the manor, explaining that there was something very important he needed to see with his own eyes before the sun set over the mountains. Eliza immediately protested, her tone of voice heavy with a zealous and adorable concern, fiercely arguing that the biting winter wind could bring the terrible illness back, and that his lungs were not yet fully healed to face the damp, freezing air of the open yards. But Leonard's mild, calm smile and almost pleading look completely disarmed her. He solemnly promised it would be a very short walk, just to the back of the manor's grounds, and argued in a velvety tone that he desperately needed her help to make that journey safely. Overcome by the sweetness of his request, Eliza draped her own crocheted shawl over her shoulders, looped her arm through the tycoon's strong arm, and together they began the slow journey out of the house. The walk to the immense glass greenhouse at the back of the property seemed to last an eternity for his untrained muscles. With every uncertain step on the white gravel of the yard, Leonard had to stop to catch his freezing breath, but he didn't loosen his grip on Eliza's arm for a single second, delighting in the physical proximity and the comforting warmth of her body against his. When they finally turned the brass doorknob and opened the large, heavy, iron-framed doors, a delicious gust of hot, humid and perfumed air enveloped them immediately. The tycoon's heart raced wildly as he looked around and processed the marvelous scene. The place he loved so much, his secret refuge of sensitivity and peace, was wonderfully intact. The rustic wooden shelves displayed row upon row of rare orchids in full, glorious splendor. The incredibly vibrant colors of the exotic petals contrasted poetically with the gray, dead winter landscape outside. There were cascading clusters of purple, white, yellow and burgundy-streaked flowers, exhaling a sweet, complex and slightly earthy perfume. Leonard walked slowly down the narrow central aisle of the greenhouse, running his trembling, awe-struck fingers over the thick, green, sap-filled leaves, ecstatic at what he was witnessing. The tycoon stopped suddenly before a specific bench at the back of the greenhouse, where a glazed ceramic pot rested majestically, containing the rarest and most absurdly delicate flower in his entire vast collection. It was an exotic species, with translucent petals, which required extreme daily care regarding air humidity and room temperature, something he deeply feared having lost forever during the long weeks of his feverish unconsciousness. The flower was magnificent, sovereign, with its petals open like delicate glass butterfly wings, greeting the oblique light that pierced the transparent roof. The tycoon turned slowly to Eliza, his dark eyes brimming with a gratitude so profound that ordinary words could barely express the magnitude of the feeling. He murmured, his voice thick with contained emotion, that those flowers should never have survived the peak of the mountain winter without the basement furnaces constantly lit and watched. Eliza instantly lowered her gaze, a modest and purely sincere smile playing at the corners of her pink lips, and explained naturally that she would sneak down there 3 times during the coldest early mornings, carrying heavy firewood to replenish the central heater's fire. simply because she knew how much that secret place and those fragile plants meant to him. That silent confession of absolute dedication and nocturnal sacrifice shattered the last remaining wall of defense in Leonard's once hardened heart. He let go of his wooden cane, which fell to the greenhouse's dirt floor with a dull, ignored thud, and took a firm step toward the young woman. With both hands trembling with anticipation and reverence, he held Eliza's face with extreme delicacy, feeling the texture of her soft skin beneath the roughness of his own calluses. He looked deeply, probing the soul in the young housemaid's wide, surprised brown eyes, and confessed in a grave, emotional, and hopelessly in love tone that he had spent his entire life frantically accumulating wealth made of paper, counting coins in vaults, and buying leased lands, stupidly believing that abundant money would buy true loyalty and unconditional familial affection. But it was there, in the absolute misery of sickness and the revolting abandonment of his own flesh and blood, that he finally met the only true wealth the world had to offer men. He declared without reservation that her pure love and selfless care had not only cleared his diseased lungs and saved his mortal life, but had resurrected a soul that was already withered and dead, long before the cruel fever crossed the estate's gates. Eliza's radiant face was inches from his, their gazes locked in a gravity impossible to escape. The tycoon's slightly ragged breathing mixed with the intensely perfumed hot air of the glass greenhouse. She closed her eyes for a brief and wonderful moment, allowing herself to fully feel the comforting warmth of his masculine hands on her flushed face, and replied in an almost inaudible whisper, laden with tenderness, that never, in her entire life, had she done anything expecting coins of reward or favors in return, for her heart simply didn't know how to act in any other selfish way when she saw a human being in need of support. Leonard broke into a wide smile, a smile so genuine and luminous that it instantly erased entire years of tension, wrinkles, and severity from his striking face, and whispered back that it was exactly because she possessed that soul of pure gold that she deserved to have him lay the entire world at her feet. The moment of deep flirtation evolved into a magnetic closeness, and they stood there embracing in silence, testing the sacred limits of that new intimacy, as the evening light filtered through the dewy glass and painted the embracing couple in divine shades of orange and gold. The feeling of peace was absolute and intoxicating, a true oasis of true love, forged in the relentless fire of overcoming adversity. While celestial peace and healing romance reigned undisputed inside the Orchid Valley estate, a very different scene, filled with shadows, vices, and perverse machinations, was unfolding in the bustling neighboring town, dozens of miles away. Walter Sterling, the cowardly, snobbish, and treacherous nephew who had shamefully led the stampede at the height of the contagion crisis, was enjoying the bohemian nightlife as if he were already the undisputed heir and the new owner of the colossal tobacco fortune. Comfortably installed in the most expensive suite of a luxurious boarding house, he spent his days signing forged promissory notes with careful calligraphy, betting exorbitant amounts in card games in smoky taverns, and accumulating mountains of debt with local merchants, always arrogantly using the good name of his uncle, whom he firmly believed was dead and rotting in the abandoned manor in the hills. To Walter's rotten mind, it was just a matter of waiting patiently for the cold weather to kill the last traces of the disease on the walls of the house, and then returning triumphantly with a wagon, collecting the tobacco baron's bones and legally assuming, without shedding a drop of sweat, the immense productive lands and the astronomical profits of the bountiful autumn harvest. His sickly greed and egoism blinded him to any minimal shred of human remorse, Walter's perfectly immoral plan, however, began to crumble and miserably fall apart on a rainy Friday afternoon when he was drinking double shots of imported cognac, leaning against the dark counter of the main bar in the town square. The smoke from cigars reeked in the air when a travelling peddler, a sun-beaten man who passed through selling rolls of fine fabrics and household goods along the region's rutted dirt roads, leaned against the worn wooden bar and began to recount the latest rural news and gossip out loud. The traveller commented excitedly to anyone willing to stop and listen about the astonishing miracle that was the talk of the town around the great mountain. He reported in vivid detail that the once feared tobacco tycoon had not only survived the fatal autumn influenza, defying the gravedigger's predictions, but that he was already frequently seen walking with firm steps through the sunny yards of the immense estate, his vital strength visibly returning with each new dawn, always accompanied by a beautiful, dark-haired young woman. Upon hearing those words, which sounded like the crack of a whip in his ears, the expensive crystal glass slipped from Walter's trembling hands, shattering into dozens of glittering shards on the bar's rustic wooden floor and splashing the amber liquor across the ground. Raw, cold, paralyzing panic overtook all of his well-groomed features, draining the color from his face in the blink of an eye. If his Uncle Leonard was indeed alive, lucid, and discovered the sordid details of the unforgivable abandonment he had suffered on his deathbed, the entire millionaire inheritance would be summarily lost forever, and the colossal, unpayable debts the nephew had contracted with violent loan sharks in town would lead him straight to the dark, damp bottom of a common jail cell before the end of the month. Overcome by blind desperation and sweating cold under his elegant tailored clothes, Walter ran breathlessly through the town's narrow, muddy alleys until he reached the discreet door of Ezekiel's gloomy office. The town clerk was a man of elastic morals and corrupt nature, widely known on the sly for forging official land deeds and facilitating shady, dirty deals for the region's criminal bigwigs, always demanding heavy pouches of gold coins in return. Locked in the stuffy back room, which smelled strongly of old mold, aged paper and fresh ink, the two men sat face to face to hatch a quick and infinitely sordid plan to save the irresponsible nephew's skin. Walter argued hastily, gesturing nervously and compulsively, that even if by some satanic miracle Leonard was actually alive, breathing the mountain air, the severity and duration of the illness must, without a doubt, have left him with severely impaired judgment. With a trembling body, blind, or even on the verge of senile madness, the greedy nephew instructed the notary of dubious character to immediately prepare, using stolen official seals, an irrevocable power of attorney with full powers and a total lifetime asset transfer document, passing absolute, unrestricted, and immediate control of the Orchid Valley estate and the stuffed bank accounts in the capital directly into his name. Ezekiel, breaking into a greedy and malicious smile that revealed the absence of some smoke-darkened teeth, dipped the metallic nib of his pen into the black inkwell and began to draft the forged document with flourishing calligraphy, aggressively demanding triple the agreed price for the enormous legal risk of that audacious criminal operation. The plan hatched by the two was simple, direct, and monstrously cruel in its essence. They would travel in secret, invade the peace of the isolated estate, corner and force the convalescing man to sign the paper transferring everything. Or, if the sick uncle found the strength to resist, they would use brute force and the weight of the forged stamp from Ezekiel's office to declare the tycoon mentally incapacitated and invalid to manage his own business and his own life. Totally oblivious to and ignoring the storm of greed gathering in the cobblestone streets far away from there, the days at the estate followed their sweet new routine of physical reconstruction and an increasingly uncontained romance. Leonard spent a large part of his calm winter mornings sitting comfortably in his soft leather armchair in the large study, the sun streaming through the window pane and Eliza working diligently by his side. Because his brown eyes still tired easily and burned with prolonged reading of fine print after recovering his vision, it was the young woman who had taken on the role of reading aloud in a clear voice the dozens of backlogged commercial letters, purchase proposals, and thick accounting ledgers that had accumulated. The humble housemaid, who before the tragedy barely had formal authorization to dust the oak desk in that forbidden room, was now, ironically, the absolute guardian of the most valuable trade secrets and the primary advisor to the powerful baron. During these daily sessions of intense work, their hands constantly and purposefully brushed against each other when exchanging sheets of ruled paper, wooden rulers, and dip pens. Every touch that pretended to be accidental was immediately followed by very discreet, secret smiles and intense looks that said infinitely more than 1,000 elaborate words could express. The deep complicity between the two had, in a short time, become the most solid and beautiful foundation of that immense and productive rural property. Leonard no longer made absolutely any financial decision, no matter how simple, without first asking and seriously considering the thoughtful, intelligent, and compassion-filled opinion of the woman smelling of sweet orange who had completely conquered him. It was exactly on one of these mornings of profound calm and tranquil intimacy that the grotesque threat suddenly tore through the peaceful and harmonious silence of the valley. Leonard and Eliza were laughing, relaxed, at a visibly confusing note made by the foreman in the heavy tool warehouse ledgers, when the shrill and disturbing sound of thick carriage wheels skidding violently and aggressively on the gravel of the manor's main entrance made them stop their conversation abruptly. The mixed-breed guard dogs that usually slept lazily near the crop-curing barns began to bark furiously, bristling their fur and warning of the unwanted presence of strangers. The tycoon frowned immediately, his smile vanishing, and the old mask of ruthless authority returning to stiffen his striking features, inquiring with a deep, suspicious voice who would dare enter his property in such a disrespectful and scandalous manner without announcing themselves first. Eliza ran anxiously to the large living-room window and sharply pulled back the heavy red velvet curtain to look outside. Her heart sank painfully in her chest, and a freezing, paralyzing chill ran down her spine as she clearly saw the two figures in dark suits hastily dismounting from the black, rented carriage from town. Her voice trembling from the nervousness that returned to haunt and squeeze her chest with invisible claws, Eliza slowly turned to Leonard, her brown eyes wide, and said with difficulty that the greedy ghosts of the past had unfortunately returned to haunt their peace. She hastily reported that Walter, the runaway nephew, accompanied by an unknown man in a dirty suit carrying a bulky black leather briefcase full of papers, was marching quickly and aggressively toward the manor's double front doors, their expressions tense, furious, and clearly decided on causing major trouble. The bombshell news of the return of the cowardly nephew who had left him to starve to death did not cause fear in Leonard. On the contrary, it made the tycoon's blood boil in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. The poetic peace that had inhabited his recent days of romance and recovery gave way, in a fraction of a second, to a cold, calculating, and absolutely controlled fury. The fragile man, who was left to agonize in the darkness of a feverish room, was definitely not the same man who was now standing, alert and invigorated. Leonard firmly gripped the rounded silver knob of his walking cane, the broad knuckles of his fingers turning completely white from the enormous force he applied to the wood, and rose from the leather armchair with his back perfectly straight, his broad shoulders thrust back, assuming the giant, imposing posture of a true leader, reclaiming his rightful throne. Walter's heavy, arrogant, and impatient footsteps echoed across the varnished wooden porch, followed by extremely violent and disrespectful pounding on the double oak front doors of the grand house. The ungrateful nephew shouted loudly outside, his shrill voice echoing across the veranda, demanding with blind arrogance that the oak door be opened immediately, declaring to the four winds that the legitimate and sole heir of the Sterling family had finally arrived to take absolute control of the entire drifting estate situation. Eliza took a trembling step back, instinctive fear trying to dominate her and stifle her voice in the face of the situation's aggressiveness. But Leonard's imposing and restored figure moved with surprising agility and placed himself in front of the young woman's body. Like a massive and totally impassable human protective shield, the tycoon looked with calculated coldness at the heavy wooden door that shook and creaked under the intruder's insistent, ill-mannered pounding outside, and then turned his face to look deeply at the extraordinary woman who, with her patience and herbal tea, had restored his life, his sight, and his heart. In the now healed and sharp eyes of the tobacco baron, there was an ironclad, savage, and absolutely unshakable determination that no one in the world, much less a cowardly parasitic relative who fled at the first sign of trouble, would destroy the pure love, respect, and ruthless justice that had bloomed so beautifully within those protective walls during the nights of the terrible storm. The epic confrontation that would seal once and for all the final fate of that vast fortune, punish the true villains, and irrefutably prove the healing power of true love, was only a few brief, tense seconds away from exploding and changing everything forever. The oak door of the Orchid Valley estate had never sounded so heavy as in that instant. The dull, rhythmic sound of Walter's pounding reverberated through the stone walls of the main hallway, echoing through the empty rooms like a war drum, announcing a battle the greedy nephew didn't imagine he had lost before it even began. Leonard stood still for a few seconds, taking slow, deep breaths, filling the lungs that Eliza had healed with her late-night balms, feeling the comforting warmth of the young woman's hand on his broad back. That discreet, encouraging touch was the last bit of fuel he needed. He planted his cane firmly on the walnut floor, straightened the collar of his linen shirt, and walked toward the main door with slow, calculated, and absolutely confident steps, like a man who knows every inch of the territory that is rightfully his. Eliza followed closely behind, just 2 steps away, maintaining a serene posture despite the racing heart hammering against her ribs. She had dedicated entire weeks of her life, sacrificing her rest, her comfort, and her own safety to bring that man back to the world of the living, and she wouldn't let any dark-suited vulture arrive to undo everything built with sweat, eucalyptus balm, and sleepless nights watching the breathing of a man who barely knew her name. Leonard placed his hand on the brass doorknob and turned it with a sharp, definitive click. The door opened heavy and slow, letting in the cold wind of the Appalachian winter along with the figures of Walter and Ezekiel. The nephew involuntarily stepped half a pace back when he saw his uncle standing, erect and lucid, staring at him with those brown eyes that had always intimidated him since childhood. Walter had arrived there mentally rehearsing a speech of condolences and supposed family concern, expecting to find a bedridden, blind, or delirious man who could barely hold a pen. What he found was exactly the opposite. Leonard Sterling, tobacco baron of the Orchid Valley estate, was standing on the threshold of his own door, with the posture of one who never ceased to be the lord of that land. An expression of absolute defeat crossed Walter's face for a fraction of a second before being covered by his trained mask of arrogance. The nephew managed to sketch a forced smile, the corners of his mouth pulled up with effort, and said with an oily, feignedly relieved voice that thank God his dear uncle had recovered, that they were all so worried about his health, and that he had come personally to check on the state of affairs. Leonard did not reply immediately. He let the silence hang intentionally over Walter for a long, uncomfortable time, analyzing every detail of the nephew from top to bottom with the sharp eye of someone who had spent his life negotiating with dishonest men. Then he shifted his gaze to the man in the shabby suit next to Walter. the leather briefcase tucked under his arm, and asked in a low, dangerous tone who that individual was and what the reason for his presence on his private property was. Walter nervously adjusted his collar and replied with a calculated voice that he had brought Ezekiel, a trusted town clerk, just to help organize some important estate papers, since, with all the confusion of the illness, it was prudent to regularize some documentary matters of the farm while his uncle was still recovering. The word estate slipped from Walter's mouth with the naturalness of someone who didn't notice the slip-up. But Leonard noticed. And Eliza noticed too, lightly squeezing the edge of the shawl she held, her brown eyes darting quickly to the tycoon's face to gauge his reaction. The tobacco baron raised a thick eyebrow and let a slow, cold smile draw across his face. A smile Eliza had never seen before, a smile that had no warmth whatsoever and that made the room's temperature drop 2 degrees. Leonard stated in a measured voice that estate was a very interesting word to use when the person in question was still standing, breathing, and in very good health. Ezekiel the clerk, nervous about the direction the situation was taking, decided to take the lead. He popped his leather briefcase open with a snap and began to pull out the papers with the forged seals, fanning them out under his arm and arguing in a trained, bureaucratic voice that they were just standard documents that any property owner would need to sign to protect his assets in case of temporary incapacitation, that it was just a routine formality and that the tycoon didn't need to worry about the details. He just needed to affix his signature to the 3 cross marks at the end of each document. Leonard slowly pulled his silver watch from his vest pocket, wound the mechanism with deliberately slow movements, and checked the time with absolute calm, as if the 2 men on the porch were a visit of lesser importance than the second hand. Then he returned the watch to his pocket, raised his eyes again, and asked in the tone of someone doing a favor by explaining the obvious, if Ezekiel really thought that anyone in their right mind would sign a paper they hadn't had time to read carefully, brought by an unknown man who arrived uninvited, in the company of a nephew who fled like a thief in the dead of night when he thought his uncle was dying. The silence that fell over the veranda after those words was of a rare quality. The biting wind swayed the tall canopies of the trees at the back of the estate. A hawk glided slowly over the tobacco fields in the distance. The guard dogs kept barking angrily by the barns, as if the animals also knew how to separate the good from the bad, with an instinct that humans sometimes lost with age. Walter discarded his honeyed mask and showed his true face. His voice came out thicker and more aggressive, stating that Leonard had spent weeks ill and that this, for any good lawyer, would be enough to question his full capacity to manage the business. The nephew argued that the farm was at a standstill, that the harvest was at risk without an administrator present, and that the family needed to make urgent decisions before the loss was irretrievable. He added with an audacity bordering on the absurd that the presence of a simple maid in the manor's corridors also gave rise to all sorts of dubious interpretations about his uncle's mental state. It was that last part that lit the final spark. Leonard took a step forward, crossing the threshold, facing his nephew from a distance of feet that seemed like inches due to the intensity of his glare. The tycoon's voice came out low, controlled, and sharp as a well-honed blade, saying that there were 2 things in that instant he was certain about regarding Walter. The first was that his nephew had never developed any true respect for honest work. And the second was that the man standing before him had no idea what the true care of one human being for another meant. Leonard declared that while Walter slept in soft boarding-house beds and gambled other people's money at card tables, it was Eliza, and only Eliza, who stayed by his side in the darkest early hours, who changed his compresses, who lit the heater in his greenhouse so his plants wouldn't die, and who held his hand at the only time he truly needed it. And that this woman, the tycoon concluded, pointing a finger toward the door, was worth more than all the sterling heirs combined. Ezekiel took 2 steps back, feeling the situation had slipped completely out of his control. He still tried to argue bureaucratically that the documents were legitimate and that there were stamped seals attesting to their validity, but the words died in his throat when Leonard held out his hand and calmly asked him to hand over those papers. The clerk looked at Walter, then at the tycoon, and decided that in that moment the smartest choice was not to resist. He handed over the entire folder with trembling fingers. Leonard took the documents one by one, observed the irregular seals, the wrong dates, and the forged signatures with the experienced eye of someone who had spent decades signing real contracts, and then snapped the folder shut with a dry, definitive click. He informed Ezekiel, with the coldness of someone merely reporting a factual piece of data, that the material would be handed over to the county sheriff later that week, along with a full account of the events, and that it would be wise for the clerk not to try leaving town in the coming weeks. Walter opened his mouth to protest, but his voice failed him upon meeting Leonard's eyes. The tycoon informed his nephew without anger, without shouting, without drama, but with the undeniable serenity of truth spoken by someone with the power to act, that from that day forward his name and the names of all the others who fled on that rainy night were permanently crossed out of any document of the Orchid Valley estate, out of any will, out of any present or future inventory. He said Walter could continue to do what he always did, look for shortcuts, fake affection, and leech onto other people's fortunes, but the road to the estate was permanently closed to him, and that this would be the last cordial warning before the matter migrated entirely into the hands of the law. Walter stood on the porch for a long moment, his face red with humiliation, his hands clenched at his sides. But there was something in Leonard's steady gaze that completely stripped him of the will to fight. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hate, it was something much more devastating. It was the complete disinterest of a man who had already moved past the disappointment and decided to move forward without looking back. The nephew spun on his heels, descended the porch steps without another word, and got into the black carriage behind the clerk, who was already inside, huddled on the seat. The wheels spun on the gravel, the carriage rounded the curve of the main entrance, and disappeared down the mountain dirt road. The sound of the wheels gradually faded until it merged with the wind in the trees, leaving behind only the golden peace of the winter afternoon. Leonard stood on the porch for a few moments, watching the dust cloud the carriage wheels kicked up as it pulled away. His breathing was controlled, his shoulders relaxed slowly, and a feeling he couldn't precisely name, but which immensely resembled freedom, began to expand in his chest. 40 years of feigned obligations, of dinners with people he knew didn't like him, of calculated smiles and self-interested hugs, all of that had gone down the dirt road along with Walter's carriage. He felt lighter than he had in his entire adult life. It was then that he felt Eliza's silent and discreet presence by his side. The young woman had approached soundlessly, as was her custom, and stood at the threshold, watching with eyes welling up with a mixture of relief and admiration. The tycoon turned to her, and for the first time in many years he felt the urgent and undeniable need to share a moment of victory with someone who truly cared about what it meant. He broke into a tired but genuine smile, held out his hand toward the young woman, and simply said it was time to have a hot cup of coffee, if she still wanted to keep him company. Before we witness the most beautiful and awaited conclusion of this story, I need to pause here, because this moment you are about to witness deserves to be experienced in the silence of your heart. But before that, I want to know from you who have been following along, this final moment where Leonard expelled the falsehood and kept only the truth. Did this moment touch you? Let me know in the comments what you felt, because stories like this are told for special people, and you, who stayed until the end, are certainly one of them. The estate's kitchen was warmed by the live fire of the iron stove when the two sat at the rustic wooden table with time-worn edges. Eliza prepared the strong coffee in silence, running the white linen cloth through the cotton filter with the smooth, automatic movements of someone who knows that task by heart, while Leonard rested his arms on the wooden table and watched her in a way he no longer tried to hide. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with the perennial aroma of sweet orange and eucalyptus that Eliza carried, creating an atmosphere of domestic intimacy in the kitchen that no money in the world could buy or reproduce. She filled the two white porcelain cups with blue rims and sat in the chair opposite him, resting her elbows on the table, unconsciously mirroring his posture. Leonard wrapped his large, calloused hands around the hot cup, breathed in the coffee steam for a moment, and then raised his eyes to her. With a seriousness unlike anything he had said before, without the urgency of the feverish confession in the glass greenhouse, but with the calm solidity of a man who had taken the time to weigh every word, he began by saying, there was one thing that needed to be said clearly, now that the house had been cleansed of everything false. Eliza slowly set down her cup and listened to him. The tycoon continued, explaining that he had spent his entire life being admired for everything he owned, for the size of his lands, for his reputation as a hard man, for the weight of the sterling surname. But in those weeks of darkness and fever, of blindness and helplessness, it was the only time in his life he was loved just for who he was, a vulnerable, broken, frightened man, longing to feel that he mattered to someone. And that discovery, he said, was worth every minute of suffering he endured. Eliza listened to everything with that deep calm that was her trademark, her attentive brown eyes fixed on his face, without interrupting. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment, then tilted her head slightly to the side, as she always did when organizing her thoughts honestly, and replied that she also had something important to say. She told him she grew up being taught by her grandmother that a human being's greatest wealth wasn't what they accumulated, but what they were capable of giving without expecting anything in return, and that when she stayed there in that huge, empty manor, choosing not to leave, she wasn't making a calculation for future reward. She was just being who she was. But throughout those weeks of midnight compresses and ticking watches and orchids, watered at 3 a.m, something she hadn't planned happened inside her chest, something she didn't know how to name at first, but that now, sitting in that warm kitchen with the coffee cooling in front of her, she recognized very well. Leonard didn't need her to name it. He stood up slowly from the chair, walked around the table with slow steps, and stopped beside Eliza, who looked up to face him with shining eyes. The tycoon retrieved the solid silver watch from his vest pocket, that same watch she had placed under the pillow so the steady ticking would keep him anchored to life during the worst deliriums. He popped it open with his thumb, revealing the inner lid, where, engraved decades ago by a Philadelphia silversmith, there was only the sterling family crest. Leonard stared at the watch for a moment, then closed it into Eliza's hand, wrapping her fingers around the cold silver object. He told her that watch had belonged to his father and his father's father, that it was the most valuable possession he owned before meeting her, and that from that day forward, the only person who had the right to keep that object was the person who had proven to be the most careful guardian of all things fragile and true. Eliza's heart raced beneath her cotton blouse. She felt the weight of the watch in the palm of her hand, felt the warmth of his hand wrapping around hers, and looked up to meet his gaze. Leonard asked, his voice deep and slightly trembling like a man who had never been so honest in his entire life, if she would agree to stay. Not as a housemaid, not as an employee, not as a caregiver, but as the woman by his side, as the person who turned the immense cold manor into a place worth waking up in every morning. He said he knew their worlds were different, that her surname wasn't on any land deed, that she had no silk dresses or gold jewelry. But he had spent his whole life surrounded by people with surnames and jewelry and land deeds, and none of them had stayed with him when the night was darkest. She had stayed, A solitary tear slipped from the corner of Eliza's right eye before she could contain it. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her fingers. But the smile that took over her face was of such genuine beauty that the entire manner seemed to light up by reflection. She replied in a firm voice, despite her emotion, that she had never been a woman to stay in places where she wasn't welcome. But there, in that kitchen smelling of coffee and old wood, on that estate of endless tobacco fields and glass greenhouses and rare orchids, she felt welcome in a way she hadn't felt anywhere in the world before. And yes, with her voice almost breaking with contained emotion, she said yes, she would stay. The ticking of the silver watch in Eliza's closed hand pulsed like a second heart between them, as Leonard leaned in slightly and placed his lips with extreme softness on the young woman's forehead. A simple gesture, devoid of exhibitionism, that carried all the respect and love that words were still learning to contain. The cold winter wind continued to blow outside, sweeping through the fields and making the tree branches bend. But inside that fire-lit kitchen, the cold did not exist. In the days that followed, the Orchid Valley estate gradually awoke from a long slumber. Leonard, his energy fully restored and a new purpose illuminating every decision, began to call back the trusted workers who had left during the crisis, one by one. Personally explaining what had happened and what would change from then on, he made sure that the back wages were paid in full on each employee's first day back, without discussion. The estate, which had lain dormant for weeks, began to pulse again. The curing barns were swept and prepared for the harvest, the warehouses were inspected, the mules were re-shod. The sound of human voices and honest work filled the valley again, like a music that had been missing for far too long. Eliza, for her part, underwent a silent but absolutely visible transformation. She remained the same woman with a gentle voice and soft steps, but she carried on her shoulders the posture of someone who had found her place in the world. She took over the complete domestic administration of the manor, no longer as an obedient maid, but as the lady of the house that home had always needed to have. She organized the pantry, reviewed the contracts with the general store suppliers, renegotiated the tobacco prices with the town brokers when she realized Leonard had been cheated for years by below-market rates, and still found time to go down to the glass greenhouse early every morning to tend the rare orchids with the same hands that previously prepared healing balms. Dr. Irvin returned to the estate on an August afternoon, no longer as an emergency physician, but as a friend. The old doctor, who had witnessed Eliza's superhuman dedication during the worst moments, entered the living room and stopped when he saw the two of them sitting together at the coffee table with papers scattered about, discussing the numbers for the next harvest with the complicity of life partners. The doctor observed the scene in silence for a moment, then said in a slightly emotional tone that he had cured many people in his long career, but that he had never seen anything that healed deeper than love, received at the right time. Leonard looked up from the paper, looked at Eliza, who was smiling with flushed cheeks, and told the doctor he could believe it, for he was living proof of it. Providence also took care of the chapter of Walter Sterling and Ezekiel the clerk, in a way neither could ignore. The forged documents handed over to the proper authorities resulted in the opening of a formal investigation. Ezekiel's office was shut down by judicial order a few months later, and the clerk faced legal consequences for the forgeries. As for Walter, the debts he had accumulated in the town finally caught up with him, and the nephew who dreamed of a bountiful inheritance was forced to sell even his personal belongings to pay off what he owed. There was no cruelty on Leonard's part in this resolution. The tycoon simply did not intervene, did not protect, and did not interfere. Life took care of distributing the consequences that each one's character had cultivated. The news of the tobacco baron's recovery and the profound changes that had taken over the Orchid Valley estate spread throughout the entire region like the scent of flowers after the rain. Merchants, neighbors from nearby farms, and long-time acquaintances began to appear on weekends to verify with their own eyes what the rumors claimed. And they all found the same scene. Leonard Sterling walking through the well-tended fields with a straight back and the silver watch in his pocket, and Eliza by his side with a colourful scarf in her dark hair, both talking, pointing at the plants, smiling with the intimacy of those who share an entire world just for the two of them. What used to be a manor of closed doors and austere silence became a place from which the smells of baking bread and the sounds of laughter drifted on the wind. And so the months passed, gentle and full. The harvest of that following year was the best in 7 years, not by a miracle, but by the combination of well-treated land and decisions made by people who cared about the outcome. Leonard and Eliza began to build together a routine that felt like it had existed a lifetime. So natural and perfectly fitted were the pieces of their characters. He learned from her to pay attention to the small details that make the difference between a plant that blooms and one that withers. She learned from him that knowing the real value of things is not a weakness, but the greatest wisdom a human being can develop. On an especially luminous September afternoon, when the tobacco fields were in full bloom, covering the stalks with small white and pink flowers that perfumed the air of the entire estate with a scent reminiscent of wild jasmine, Leonard asked Eliza to accompany him to the glass greenhouse once more. It had become their tradition to visit the orchids together whenever there was something important to say, as if that place of fragile flowers and constant care had become their private, sacred confessional. When they entered the heated greenhouse, he led her directly to the back bench where the rarest orchid in the collection rested, the same one she had saved during those winter dawns. The plant had developed new shoots, small light green stems reaching upward with a quiet and beautiful determination. Leonard pulled the silver watch from his pocket, popped the case open with his thumb, and gazed at the inside for a moment. Then he raised his eyes to Eliza and said, with the tranquility of someone who made his decision a long time ago, that he had sent a Philadelphia silversmith to engrave something new on the inside of the lid. He turned the watch so she could read the newly made inscription. In the polished metal, in careful lettering, was engraved her name, Eliza, and just below it, a date. The date Eliza decided to stay. Leonard said that date would be the most important on the estate's calendar, and that, if she agreed, he would like to turn it into another important date. The date she would become Eliza Sterling. And the estate would finally have a lady with her own name and a grand heart engraved on its deeds. The warm, perfumed air of the greenhouse seemed to stop circulating for a moment. The leaves of the orchids did not move. The only sound was the incessant and faithful ticking of the silver watch in Leonard's hands, accompanying the racing beats of their two hearts in the botanical silence of that special place. Eliza stared at the inscription in the metal, at her own name, permanently etched into the object that had been their first bond, and felt an emotion so vast and at the same time so simple that she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She decided to do both at the same time, and Leonard, seeing this, broke into the most complete and relieved smile of his entire life. She said yes. The ticking of the silver watch continued, steady and faithful, marking every second of the rest of that golden afternoon. Time, as it always does with stories worth telling, passed, and with it came everything that true love plants and honest care waters. 6 years after that September afternoon in 1924, the Orchid Valley estate was unrecognizable to anyone who had known it during the days of the solitary and severe Baron. The manor's facade had been resurfaced with whitewashed plaster. The windows had new, clear panes and green-painted frames, and the wooden porch now displayed pots of colourful flowers that Eliza had planted, which bloomed with the same quiet determination as she did. The wrought-iron entrance gate had been replaced by a varnished wooden arch, carved with two intertwined initials, the L and the E of the Sterling family, which no longer merely signified an old surname, but the promise of a home. Leonard had aged with the handsome dignity of men who lived every day with purpose. His black hair had gained white strands at the temples and in the short beard he had started wearing, which Eliza said in a tone of affectionate teasing made him look more like a wise professor than a tobacco baron. He still carried the silver watch in his vest pocket, but now, every morning before going out to inspect the yards, he would run his thumb over the lid and read the name engraved inside. A ritual he had never failed to perform since the day she said yes in the glass greenhouse. There was something comforting and necessary in that gesture of verifying every single day that the love that saved him was still real and still there. Eliza, for her part, had blossomed in a way she herself hadn't imagined possible. The woman with the gentle voice and invisible footsteps had become, over the years, the visible and absolutely necessary soul of the estate. Not only did she manage the manor with wisdom, but she had expanded her natural knowledge of herbs and balms in a way that brought her recognition from the entire region. Dr. Irvine, now quite elderly, had begun informally referring families from the rural area to her for guidance on preventative natural remedies, and Eliza received these neighbours in the grand estate kitchen every Tuesday, distributing teas, ointments, and words of care with the same generosity that was always her deepest nature. Leonard observed all this with immense quiet pride, never missing an opportunity to mention to any visitor that the most talented and beautiful woman in Virginia had chosen to stay in those hills. The Orchid Valley estate had become a benchmark of fair prosperity in the region. In the years following their marriage, Leonard implemented a profit-sharing system for permanent workers, an idea Eliza had suggested after observing how engagement and care for the land increased when people felt they were working for something that was partly theirs too. The harvest grew year after year, not explosively, but solidly and sustainably, like the roots of the crops that dig deep into the red earth before blooming. The Sterling name in the region ceased to be synonymous with fear and coldness and came to carry a new reputation, that of a farm where work was honest, payment was reliable, and the boss spoke to his workers looking them in the eye. On a November afternoon in 1924, Leonard and Eliza were walking side by side down the central aisle of the blooming tobacco fields. The small white flowers covered the stalks like perfumed snow, and the warm breeze carried that unmistakable scent that mixed the earth with wild jasmine, the most characteristic and beloved perfume of the entire estate. They walked slowly, unhurriedly, the way only two people very secure in each other's company can walk. Hands intertwined, she with a colourful scarf in her increasingly silver-streaked hair, he with the cane he now used more out of habit than necessity. Suddenly, Eliza stopped in the middle of the field path and gently pulled Leonard's hand so he would stop too. He obeyed, looking at her with curiosity, and noticed she was gazing at the broad horizon of mountains and fields with that contemplative expression he loved, the expression of someone storing a landscape into memory. She stood like that for a long moment, breathing the perfumed air, and then turned her face to her husband with a peaceful and profound smile. She said she was thinking about how that very estate, with the same mountains in the background and the same massive sky, seemed completely different from everything it had been before, not because the stones or the earth had changed, but because love inhabited every corner of it now. And that love, she said, changed everything it touched, invisible like the wind, but real like the red earth under their feet. Leonard looked at her for a long time with that complete attention of someone who will never tire of looking. Then he pulled the silver watch from his pocket, popped the lid open, and turned it so she could see her name engraved in the gleaming metal. He said he had a secret about that watch he had never told her. That when he was little, his father told him that watch had a special property. As long as it was wound, it would never stop working, and that the secret to a good life was exactly that, winding up the things that mattered most every single day: work, honor, and love. That he had spent decades winding the watch but forgetting to wind the love. Until a girl with the scent of sweet orange and the voice of the dawn appeared in his dark room and reminded him that the heart, just like the watch, needs daily attention to keep beating beautifully. Eliza took the watch from his hands, wound the small mechanism with slow, familiar movements, and returned it to her husband's vest pocket with an affectionate pat on his chest. She said she was in charge of winding up what mattered every single day for the rest of their lives. And from the gleam in Leonard's eyes, hearing that, it was impossible to doubt that the tobacco baron, the man who was once left to die in the darkness by his own blood, was now the most alive, richest, and most loved man in the entire valley. The wind passed through the blooming fields, carrying white petals that danced lightly around the two, like a farewell blessing from the autumn itself. The ticking of the silver watch pulsed against Leonard's chest, steady and faithful, as he and Eliza resumed their walk hand in hand down the green aisles, toward the white manor that stood at the top of the hill, with its windows open to the afternoon sun, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee drifting on the wind. The Orchid Valley estate stood tall, more alive than ever, planted on the only foundation that doesn't crumble with time, true love built through daily care, and the courage to stay when everyone else walked away. And so ended the story of Leonard and Eliza Sterling, not with an end, but with an infinite continuation of mornings with coffee, afternoons with orchids, and nights with the silver ticking marking every second of a life that was saved twice. First the body, then the soul.